Imagine you are standing in the middle of an open plain, 4,500 years before the flood. The red, dry earth vibrates gently beneath your feet. You heard no thunder. There is no storm. But something is moving on the horizon. You look. And then you see it, a shadow. Not the shadow of a cloud. The shadow of something that walks. Something that, when it lifts its foot, moves tons of earth as if they were grains of sand. You would try to run. But where? The creature approaching has no urgency. It never did. Because in the world that existed before the flood, the world that almost no one truly knows, it was they who dominated every plain, every mountain, every sea. And the question that no one has ever completely answered is, how did they get to where you are standing right now? This is the story of the Nephilim. The giants of the ancient world. The sons of the fallen angels and human women. The beings described in the Book of Enoch as creatures so massive, so powerful, so terrifying, that the entire civilization of the antediluvian world trembled in their shadow. But here is what most people never stop to ask: in a world that existed thousands of years before the flood, how did the Nephilim travel? How did beings of that colossal size move across a young, wild, and untamed planet? How did they cross seas, scale mountain ranges, and reach the farthest corners of the ancient earth? The Book of Enoch does not describe the Nephilim as creatures trapped in a single valley or confined to one region. The ancient record suggests something far more extraordinary: that these giants moved. That they traveled. That they left marks on every corner of the antediluvian world. And if you understand how they moved, you begin to understand why so many ancient civilizations, separated by oceans and thousands of years, all carry the same memory of giants walking among them. The fallen angels descended, according to the Book of Enoch, upon Mount Hermon. 200 of them. Led by the Watchers, the beings the ancient traditions called the Vigilantes, the ones who chose to abandon their celestial station and bind themselves to the material world. Their leader, Azazel, was the one who taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, the art of weapons, of adornment, of deception. And from the union of the Watchers with the daughters of men came the Nephilim. The giants. The hybrid creatures that the ancient world had never seen before and would never fully forget. But think about this for a moment. Mount Hermon sits in what we today call the region between Syria and Lebanon. A single mountain. A single point of origin. And yet the ancient traditions, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from the highlands of ancient Canaan to the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, all speak of giants. All speak of the Nephilim. All speak of massive beings who walked among human settlements, who shook the earth beneath their feet, who consumed entire harvests in a single day. How did the sons of the fallen angels spread from one mountain to every corner of the antediluvian world over the course of 4,500 years? The answer changes everything you think you know about the world before the flood. The first thing to understand is scale. The Nephilim, as described in the ancient records and the traditions derived from the Book of Enoch, were not simply tall men. They were colossal. Some ancient traditions place them at heights that dwarf anything in human experience, beings so massive that a single step covered what would take a human hours to walk. And this is precisely why their travel was unlike anything that existed in the human world. The Nephilim did not need roads. They did not need ships. They did not need the primitive paths that antediluvian humanity carved through forests and along river banks. They simply walked. And when something of that size walks, the landscape itself becomes irrelevant. Consider the mountain ranges of the ancient world. What would take a human caravan weeks to cross, navigating passes, hauling supplies, managing animals, a Nephilim could cross in a matter of days. The ancient records speak of the Nephilim striding across plains as if the horizon itself were merely a short distance away. The Book of Enoch describes a world where the Watchers and their offspring moved with a kind of terrible freedom that no human could replicate. They were not bound by terrain. They were not stopped by rivers. They were not slowed by seasons or weather in the way that small human bodies were. The fallen angels had passed to their hybrid children something of the celestial nature, an endurance, a physical capacity, that placed the Nephilim entirely outside the limitations of ordinary human travel. But there is something even more significant hidden in the ancient traditions. The Nephilim were not alone. They moved in groups. The Book of Enoch and the traditions surrounding it describe the giants organizing themselves, sometimes around the territories of their watcher fathers, sometimes in vast wandering bands that swept across the antediluvian landscape, consuming everything in their path. And this organized movement had a devastating logic to it. A single Nephilim could consume what a village stored for an entire season. A group of Nephilim moving together could depopulate a region of every living animal, every crop, every resource. This is precisely why, as the ancient records describe, the Nephilim became the central catastrophe of the antediluvian world, not because they stayed in one place, but because they moved, they spread, and they left devastation wherever they went. The ancient rivers were the highways of the antediluvian world. The Tigris, the Euphrates. The great rivers that wound through the landscape of the ancient earth were the arteries along which early human civilization moved, traded, and communicated. But for the Nephilim, these rivers presented no barrier. According to some ancient traditions, the giants waded through waters that would drown any human, their massive bodies barely slowed by currents that would carry entire trees downstream. There are hints in the traditions surrounding the Book of Enoch, preserved in fragments, in derivative texts, in the oral memories that filtered down through ancient cultures, of the Nephilim crossing the great rivers of the antediluvian world as casually as a man steps over a puddle. The fallen angels had given their children something the human world could not match, a body built for a scale that the earth itself could barely contain. And then there are the seas. The question of whether the Nephilim traveled across open water is one of the most fascinating buried in the ancient traditions. The antediluvian world, according to various ancient records, had a geography that may have been significantly different from what we know today. But even within the geography that the ancient texts describe, there are suggestions, subtle, fragmentary, but persistent, that the Nephilim were not stopped by open water. Some ancient traditions describe hybrid creatures associated with the Nephilim lineage that were at home in both the terrestrial and the aquatic worlds. The Book of Enoch speaks of the fallen angels as beings whose original nature was not bound by the physical limitations that define human existence. And if some of that nature passed to the Nephilim, then water, even the vast primordial seas of the antediluvian world, may not have been the barrier it would be for human civilization. Consider what 4,500 years actually means. This is not a short time. This is longer than the entire span of recorded human history from the earliest Mesopotamian civilizations to today. 4,500 years is an almost incomprehensible expanse of time, enough for the Nephilim, traveling with the physical capacity described in the ancient records, to have reached every corner of the antediluvian world multiple times over. The ancient traditions do not describe the Nephilim as newly arrived creatures who had just begun to spread when the flood came. They describe a world that had been dominated by the giants for so long that human civilization had structured itself entirely around the presence of these beings. Ancient human settlements, according to some interpretations of the records surrounding the Book of Enoch, were built with the Nephilim in mind, fortified, hidden, situated in places where the terrain might offer some small protection from creatures of that scale. And here is where the mystery deepens. If the Nephilim traveled across the antediluvian world for thousands of years, then the marks of their passage should be everywhere. And perhaps they are. The ancient traditions of cultures separated by oceans and millennia share a remarkable convergence: they all remember the giants. The ancient Mesopotamian texts speak of beings of terrifying scale. The Egyptian traditions carry memories of colossal beings in the deep past. The traditions of the ancient Canaanites, preserved in fragments that survived the destruction of their civilization, speak of the Rephaim, a word that many scholars connect directly to the Nephilim and their descendants. And across the ancient world, in cultures that had no direct contact with each other, there are the same stories: giants who walked among the ancestors, who shaped the landscape, who left behind structures that later generations could barely comprehend. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim consuming the labor of human beings and then turning on the humans themselves. This consumption had a geography to it. The giants moved toward food. They moved toward human settlements. They moved toward the herds of animals that antediluvian humanity kept. And as they consumed everything in one region, they moved to the next. This was a kind of terrible migration, driven not by navigation or exploration but by appetite. An appetite that the ancient records describe as insatiable. The Nephilim, born of the union between the fallen angels and human women, carried within them a hunger that the physical world could never fully satisfy. And so they moved. Constantly. Relentlessly. Across the entire span of the antediluvian earth. But the Nephilim were not simply mindless creatures driven by hunger. The ancient traditions preserved in and around the Book of Enoch suggest something more complex and more disturbing. The fallen angels, the Watchers, had given their offspring not only physical power but knowledge. Azazel taught humanity the art of weapons and vanity. Semiaza and the other Watchers passed down forbidden knowledge that the Book of Enoch describes as the root of the corruption of the antediluvian world. And some of this knowledge passed to the Nephilim. The giants were not merely large, they were intelligent. Capable of organization. Capable of strategy. And a being of colossal size that is also intelligent and organized is a being that can plan its movements across the landscape with a terrifying efficiency. The ancient records hint at something that most readers of the Book of Enoch pass over too quickly: the Nephilim built. Not in the way that humans build, carefully, slowly, over generations, but in the way that only a being of that scale could build. There are traditions, filtered down through centuries of oral transmission and fragmentary textual survival, of the Nephilim constructing things in the antediluvian world that human civilization later encountered and could not explain. The ancient traditions of Cyclopean architecture, massive stone structures built with blocks so enormous that later generations assumed they must have been the work of giants, may carry, buried within them, the actual memory of what the Nephilim left behind as they moved across the antediluvian world. Structures that marked their passage. Territories that they claimed. Monuments to a dominance that lasted for thousands of years before the flood finally swept it all away. And this is where the most haunting question emerges. If the Nephilim traveled across the antediluvian world for 4,500 years, building, consuming, dominating, then the flood was not simply a natural disaster. According to the Book of Enoch and the traditions surrounding it, the flood was a response. The ancient records describe the cries of the antediluvian human population rising to heaven, cries about the devastation caused by the Nephilim, about the corruption spread by the fallen angels, about a world that had been so thoroughly transformed by the presence of these hybrid giants that humanity could no longer survive within it. The flood, in this reading of the ancient tradition, was the answer to the question of what happens when the Nephilim are allowed to travel freely across the entire earth for thousands of years. The answer was, everything is consumed. Everything is corrupted. And the only remedy is to start again. The Watchers who fathered the Nephilim were, according to the Book of Enoch, bound in the depths of the earth, imprisoned until the final judgment. But the Nephilim themselves met a different end. The ancient records describe the giants turning on each other, a final catastrophic conflict among the hybrid offspring of the fallen angels, a war of giants that devastated what the flood had not yet reached. And when the flood came, it completed what the giants' own violence had begun. The Nephilim, those colossal travelers of the antediluvian world, those beings who had crossed every plain and river and mountain range for thousands of years, were destroyed. Or so the ancient tradition holds. But here is what the Book of Enoch adds, in a passage that has troubled readers for centuries. The spirits of the Nephilim, the disembodied spirits of the giants who died, did not simply cease to exist. The ancient text describes these spirits as lingering, as wandering, as continuing to afflict the human world even after the physical bodies of the Nephilim had been destroyed. The great travelers of the antediluvian world became, in death, invisible travelers, spirits without bodies, moving through a human civilization that had no understanding of what they were or where they came from. This is perhaps the most unsettling element of the entire tradition, that the journey of the Nephilim did not end with the flood. It simply changed form. And this may be why the memory of the Nephilim survived. Because their influence did not end when the waters receded. Because the fallen angels who fathered them were imprisoned but not destroyed. Because the human civilizations that emerged after the flood carried within their collective memory, in their myths, in their religious traditions, in their architectural impulses, in their stories of giants and monsters and hybrid creatures, the actual historical memory of a world that the Nephilim had traveled and dominated for 4,500 years. The ancient Mesopotamians remembered. The Egyptians remembered. The Canaanites remembered. And even today, when we read the Book of Enoch, when we study the ancient traditions surrounding the Nephilim and the fallen angels and the world before the flood, we are participating in a memory that stretches back to the very beginning of human civilization, a memory of the giants who walked the ancient earth, who traveled its every corner, who left behind a world so corrupted that only the flood could cleanse it. The next time you look at a mountain range and try to imagine crossing it without modern technology, remember what the ancient traditions say about the Nephilim. They crossed those mountains without roads, without vehicles, without any of the tools that human civilization depends on. They crossed them because their bodies were built for a scale that the human world never matched. They crossed them because they were the sons of the fallen angels, beings who had descended from beyond the physical world and left in their hybrid children something of that boundless, terrible freedom. The Nephilim traveled for 4,500 years before the flood came. And the world they traveled through was never the same again.